Hey everyone, welcome to our lecture for Key Concept 4.3, Westward Expansion and Foreign Policy. A real quick side note here, I'm going to change the way I do the presentations a little bit. They're structured a little bit differently here. Going with more pictures here, but I'm going to include the notes down here in the speaker notes. So if you're on a laptop, you can just kind of manipulate the size here right there. If you're using an iPad, you'll see that in the top right hand corner there's like these three dots. Click on that and you can click on Use Speaker Notes, and then you can see the speaker notes that I've left. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let my computer load here. There we go. You'll notice that in the lower right hand corner there's a link to the presentation. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can simply click on that link, or you can enter that link and then you can access this presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. If you want to pause it, feel free. But here's the graphic organizer that's going to run our hopefully very brief lecture. Okay, so I'll just kind of real quickly kind of read and go over what we'll be talking about today. So in the big circle, you'll see kind of the main idea, and the main idea being that U.S. interest in expanding its national borders and staying out of foreign wars shaped foreign policy, and it also shaped government and private initiatives. Okay, so what that means is we'll be talking about America's attempt to achieve dominance in North America. We'll also be talking about how, while we are expanding during this time, there are some groups that really like this idea of expanding, while there's other groups that kind of resist the expansion of American territory and federal power. And we're also going to see that the expansion is also going to create conflict in America over the debate of slavery. Okay, so that's kind of real briefly what we'll be talking about. So let's kind of look real quickly at American expansion. Okay, American expansion during this period takes the form of both military and diplomatic initiatives, as well as economic. We're going to focus on military and diplomatic here, though. Okay, so a couple of really good examples of military expansions are the annexation of Texas and also the Mexican cession. Okay, now Texas is kind of a really interesting story here because the Texas independence is achieved by American citizens, but it's not achieved by the federal government. The federal government does not go into Texas and fight the Mexicans for control of that region. In fact, it is actually private citizens that go into Texas that are initially welcomed by Mexico to settle in Texas that are the ones that rebel against the Mexicans for a variety of reasons. Two of the big ones being the American citizens that settled in Texas had no interest in giving up slavery and also had no interest in Catholicism. And eventually they kind of butted heads with the Mexicans so much that they just decided to rebel. Now, once the Texans have achieved their independence from Mexico, there is some diplomatic measures that have to be taken to have Texas become part of the United States. In fact, there's actually some intense resistance to allowing Texas to join America because there's the whole issue of if Texas comes into the nation, it will be a slave state, and that might upset the balance. And so a lot of people are kind of against the expansion of slavery in America. But eventually, Texas is welcomed into the United States, okay, in 1845. This further angers the Mexicans, consequently, and there's eventually a war with Mexico. And we're going to focus more on the war with Mexico in the next unit. But we all know the story here. Mexico loses to the United States, and in the treaty that ended the war, Mexico ceded vast amounts of territory that make up much of the southwest United States. So this is an example of expansion through military means. Okay, it's a great example of that. Okay, we also see a great example of diplomatic expansion in Oregon country. The British and the Americans both had claims to Oregon country, but instead of fighting over it, they just used diplomatic means to basically split the territory in half. Okay. We also see during this period that the United States is very much interested in achieving dominance in the Americas. Okay, we are not interested in the rest of the world, so we are going to maintain a policy of isolationism where we're not going to get involved in European wars. And that's very much kind of the tone that is set by Washington in his neutrality proclamation and his farewell address. So the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 really kind of shows this growing sense of American nationalism. It shows that America is ready to kind of play with the big boys here a little bit. And we make a pretty bold claim, and that bold claim is Europe should essentially stay out. The United States is not going to tolerate any attempts of European colonization in the Americas. So we don't want to see the Spanish or the French try to reclaim the colonies that they've lost. We don't want to see European interference in Latin American republics that are popping up all throughout the Western Hemisphere. That's going to be our job to interfere with them. So the United States is going to attempt to achieve dominance over North America. So you're going to see a more aggressive foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, but we are going to remain kind of isolated from Europe and their affairs in the Eastern Hemisphere. Okay. Now, Americans all react very differently to this expansion of territory and the expansion of government power during this time. Some really love it, some really hate it, and some openly resist it, obviously. So some examples of resisting the growing power of the federal government and the expansion of this nation. Two really good examples of that are the Hartford Convention and the Nullification Crisis. The Hartford Convention is a great example of how the New Englanders were very, very upset about the expansion of federal power. The Federalists, which is kind of ironic actually, because the Federalists did want a strong central government. But the Federalists in New England were very much concerned with kind of the growing power of the South. The Federalists felt like their needs were being ignored in the federal government. For instance, the Embargo Act under Jefferson, the War of 1812 under Madison. Both of these things severely impact the economy of the Northeast, specifically New England. And so at the Hartford Convention, we see the New Englanders up there, the Federalists, I should say, pretty much coming together and kind of complaining about how things have been going in the past. They're kind of sick of having all these Virginia presidents. They call them the Virginia dynasty. They're sick and tired of government policy, really kind of hurting them economically. They really don't like the idea of this westward expansion because the westward expansion diminishes their political power. Because as new states enter the Union, there's more representatives, there's more senators, and the New England region obviously loses much of their power. Now, unfortunately for the New Englanders and the Federalists, I should say, this looks really unpatriotic during the War of 1812, and as a result, the Federalists are kind of demonized, as you can see in that political cartoon there, and the Federalist Party pretty much dies as a result of the Hartford Convention, and we have kind of a one-party state for about a decade or so, and that's known as the era of good feelings. We also see the Nullification Crisis as being a great example of resistance to the expansion of federal power. And we've talked about that in previous lectures, so I'm not going to go over it again, but clearly nullification is a great example of, states' rights over the federal government. We're also going to see many groups of Americans that very much want the federal government to expand the boundaries of this nation, okay? And the people that typically champion that are going to be Western whites, so whites that live in some of these new Western states. You're going to see Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, the people that live in those countries, or states, excuse me, and even some of the southern states like Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, they're very much going to want to expand westward. Okay, and two really good examples of that are the Warhawks in the War of 1812. The Warhawks are kind of this second generation of Americans. They're young, they're aggressive. They're very much patriotic people, and they very much want to expand the borders. In fact, in the War of 1812, two of their major goals are to basically take over Canada, which we attempt to do and fail, unfortunately. Just kidding. And also, they want to expand into Mississippi territory, or the land east of the Mississippi. The future states of Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana. They want to expand into those regions. They want to boot out the Native Americans so they can expand their plantation-based economy. So in the War of 1812, most of the major battles actually come against Native Americans, and as a result, that's going to allow Western whites to expand, obviously, into the West. Andrew Jackson's also a great example of a Western white who is championing westward expansion through the Indian Removal Act. He removes the 5 civilized tribes, and as a result, whites can then pour into that territory and set up their plantation-based economy there. Okay. Obviously, we're going to see resistance to this. Native Americans attempt to resist the expansion through both war and diplomatic/judicial means. The Native Americans, specifically the Creeks and the Cherokees especially, they actually go through the court system to protest the expansion of Western whites into their territory. And the Supreme Court actually does rule in their favor in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, but Andrew Jackson pretty much ignores it. In fact, Jackson actually says John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So Jackson pretty much just ignores the Supreme Court, and Western whites continue to pour into these Indian regions. In Florida, we see the Seminole Wars break out from 1835 to 1842. There's not a lot of Seminoles left, but they've showed themselves to be incredibly feisty and incredibly good warriors, and they're able to resist westward expansion in Florida, for about 7 years. Eventually, they do fall, and most of them get shipped out to Oklahoma with the rest of the Southwest Native Americans. Okay. So, anyways, all of this acquisition of land, the last thing we want to focus on, all this acquisition of land is going to, it does look cool on the map to see that our country is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We all kind of know how the story ends. We all know that, as the country expands, there's growing pains. Okay, it opens us up for more debate over slavery, and slavery is an incredibly divisive issue during this time. And as the country expands, slavery becomes a major issue, and we're going to see throughout the 19th century a series of compromises that attempts to kind of alleviate the tensions that are building over slavery. The first of those compromises is the Missouri Compromise, which we've talked about in class before. I think the map is pretty clear on what the Missouri Compromise does. The Missouri Compromise does kind of delay the conflict over slavery for a little bit, but obviously it's not going to be successful in solving the whole slavery problem. Okay, so anyways, guys, we're going to stop there. Feel free to give me some feedback. If you have a copy of this presentation, just click on the feedback link. If you don't have a copy of this presentation, just enter the web address there, and you'll take a real quick Google form, and you can just give me some feedback on how you think the lecture went. Thanks, guys.